So welcome everyone to this panel discussion on advocacy for Black small businesses. I'm so excited to be here with you. My name is Cliff Barber. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Archdiocese of Chicago. But more importantly, I'm a great friend of BBIF and of Inez Long, who brought me here and has inspired me for years. I'm just so happy to be part of this gathering and this discussion that's so important and relevant to where we are right now. I'm very pleased to be here with two other passionate advocates for Black-owned small businesses. Sadaf Knight, who is the CEO of the Florida Policy Institute, and also Dr. Dell, who's the Senior Community Development Advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Just so pleased to be here with you both, Sadaf and Dell, just to have this conversation on where we are with Black-owned small businesses. You know, Malcolm X famously said, when the country gets a cough, Black people get a cold. And that often quoted, oft-quoted words from Malcolm X couldn't apply more accurately to where we are right now. We find ourselves with small businesses in this country and in particularly here in Florida. And, you know, we know that businesses are the owners and the businesses themselves both have been affected disproportionately in our community by the COVID pandemic. We know that we've had disproportionate numbers of deaths. We know that economically this has disproportionately affected our community. And therefore, we know that disproportionately it has affected our businesses. And we, in this discussion here, wanted to try to dig into that and find out kind of where we are right now, and also, too, what we can do positively to advocate to address the challenges that we now face. I want to turn to you first, Dell, just to give us a sense of the landscape, where we are, what's kind of really happened to small businesses, what the challenges are, just so we all have that kind of level understanding.
Yes, thanks, Cliff. And I'll be brief before I turn it over to Sadaf. But most people know, and especially those of you who've heard me speaking for BBIF in the past, that Black businesses face a lot of disparity as it comes to, you know, non-white or other ethnicities and white-owned businesses. And in particular, we just don't have a lot of good data on it. So I'm going to give you the best that I could find and then kind of talk real briefly about the impact of the pandemic. So in Florida, the most recent 2017 census data shows that Black businesses with employees only generate about 38% of the revenue of non-minority firms and employ about 6 employees to 10 to those same non-minority firms. This is not a surprise. But while you may listen to that and say, well, yeah, that's not that bad, you have to understand that only 6 to 7% on average of Black businesses actually have employees. The rest are non-employer-owned firms, versus about 20% of non-minority firms. So about 1 every 5 non-minority firms, pretty much white-owned firms, have employees. Only 67 to 7% of Black businesses have it. And not to mention the fact that fewer of us start businesses as a percentage of our population rate. So when you put all those numbers together, Black businesses have a long way to go. But that's not to mean that there hasn't been some progress prior to the pandemic. You know, Black, both male and female, but particularly Black female businesses have grown at an extraordinary rate. You know, we wrote a report on that at the Fed talking about how they led the entire nation with 1 million firms created between 2002 and 2012. But the challenge is again, that they're overwhelmingly small. We're not really seeing a lot of scalability. We're not seeing a lot of diversity of industry, a lot of clustering. So when it comes to the pandemic, most of you may have heard already the report that came out early on that as of April last year, when the pandemic hit, 41% of all Black businesses closed during that time, roughly 2 times the rate of white-owned businesses. Now, when we say close, we have to be very careful what we mean by that, because we're not necessarily saying a permanent closure, which is shown by when the data was last updated, that I could find that by August, that number of 41% closing dropped to probably around the mid to upper 20% level. But here's some things that you have to think about. And this is national numbers, not Florida-specific numbers. We don't have those kind of numbers. But here's some things to think about, though, that this does not account necessarily for the time and business loss, the income loss based upon being sick with pandemic. We know us as Black people have been hit harder by that. It doesn't talk about the number of sales that have declined due to the pandemic. This is just saying what happened with the closures and openings. Has nothing to do with the rest of the economic impact that the pandemic has caused. And we know also that this is going to change based upon what's happening with fiscal policy and the stimulus money that comes from that at the federal level, and also what states do. So we have a lot of work to do around policy and the recovery with the pandemic. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sadaf.
Thanks, Dell. So I'll bring it home a little bit and talk about sort of the economic context here in Florida. So what does it look like in the context in which our small businesses are operating and trying to grow and develop? Prior to COVID, we were in a period of economic growth and expansion, sort of looking at the aggregate. We had low unemployment, and there was a lot of talk about how we had a comeback economy after the last recession. But it only takes peeling back just a little bit to see that there were still deep inequities that were baked into our economy. For example, we have the second highest poverty rate in the country. And we know that poverty impacts different communities in different ways. So Black and Latinx communities in Florida have much higher poverty rates compared to white communities. We have one of the worst affordable housing shortages in the nation, and people are finding it increasingly difficult to live near where they work. And Florida ranks poorly across a whole bunch of different indicators, from education to healthcare to, across the board, at or near the bottom in the nation, in terms of how well we're performing in terms of, health and well-being of our communities. So in the time between the last recession and before COVID hit, while most states increased their investment in public services, Florida actually did not do that. So while other states were actually reinvesting in their communities as their economies grew, we stayed flat pretty much that whole time. And this is despite the great needs that we have in our state and despite our growing population. The COVID-19 pandemic really has just increased hardship for families across the board. Food insecurity is up. People are unable to pay their rent. Unemployment is high. And as a service and tourism-driven economy, we're a long way from economic recovery. It's going to be a long road for us here.
Right. Oh, go ahead, Sadaf. Sorry.
We continue to see job losses, and new layoffs are announced all the time. And our state revenues have really taken a dive. And this is because we rely so heavily on the sales tax to fuel our economy. In fact, 80% of our state revenues come from the sales tax. And this is really inherently inequitable. That's because it's everyday Floridians buying things that they need day to day who end up paying the sales tax. And when we look at how much people are spending as this share of their personal incomes, it's really low and moderate income Floridians who are bearing that burden the most.
So Sadaf, just as we thinking about what both you and Dell have said, this paints a pretty grim picture for what those in our audience are up against, both from a global point of view, thinking about the whole country, and also to some of the challenges you just outlined in Florida. And I guess one could just pack up and be depressed about this, or I think why we're all gathered here today is to think about, okay, what can we do about this and how can we move forward? And I know we're here both in this conference and in our gathering to really talk about policy and how we can, all of us, be involved in advocating for some solutions to the challenges that you outlined so well in your comments. I want to change or move us to focus a little bit more on how we address some of the challenges that you outlined, and so really talk about policy. We're here gathered today to talk about advocacy and policy, and I want to have our conversation kind of turn to how we address some of the challenges that you've outlined. So, Sadaf, let me start with you. I know we just talked a little about Florida, but let's stay in Florida to talk a little bit about how you see how we can advocate to address some of these challenges you just outlined.
Sure. So first, let me set a little bit of context. So, we've been talking about how we're in this pandemic that has both health and economic impacts, and that's really going to be the driver of the conversation with our legislature this year and likely beyond. So just to set a little bit of context, the state is looking at a $3 billion budget shortfall this year. And that is going to be the major issue that will be driving the discussions at the legislature. And that's the lens that they're going to be looking at policy through. So when we talk about what we're up against in terms of the economy, how does this impact small businesses? Well, small businesses thrive in communities that are thriving. And when the state invests in the things that generate truly shared economic prosperity. And very small businesses and those that are owned by people of color are so tied to the health and the vitality of their local economies and their local communities. In the last recession and in previous recessions, the go-to response policy-wise by the legislature has just been looking at funding cuts for critical programs to get us through these budget crises. If that's the path that the legislature takes again this time, our communities are only going to face even more hardship and they're going to face even more suffering. Our local economies are going to continue to lag, and those inequities that I talked about earlier are just going to further entrench and further deepen. Issues like education, healthcare, conservation, economic development, infrastructure, all of these things, they may not be directly small business issues on the surface, but these are the things that we need to invest in to ensure that we have healthy economies and economic growth that really benefits everybody. Our state's economic development policies have really focused on attraction and retention of large corporations, and mostly through tax incentive programs. And other than a few things like the state small business development centers or disaster-related loan programs, there really hasn't been a concerted effort around small businesses or Black-owned small businesses. Unfortunately, the legislature does not appear to be tackling these issues in the upcoming session, despite all of these huge challenges. The focus has already been on making funding cuts and taking on other sort of more tangential issues like liability protection for businesses, which would make it harder for people to sue a business if they got COVID or something, which, to be frank, is a solution that's looking for a problem. There haven't been a whole lot of lawsuits around this. So we haven't really seen a lot of focus on these big picture issues, or more specifically issues that would really help small businesses weather this crisis and be stronger in the future. So what should the legislature really be focusing on? First and foremost, making our economy more equitable. Utilizing levers to raise revenue and enacting policies to raise revenue so that we can invest in our communities rather than making cuts and rather than giving away tax breaks in the name of economic growth and economic development. They could also be focused on providing real help for small businesses, not only, like I said, to weather this crisis, but also, how they can access capital, how they can access services and resources that they need to really grow, start up, grow, develop, and thrive. And I think Dell will speak to some of those ideas. And then there are some policy ideas that could be pursued in a more short term, maybe not this session, but in a more short term, that will have impacts on small businesses. And some of the legislative priorities of Florida Policy Institute include things like removing barriers to occupational licensing for returning citizens so that they can actually get jobs and be employed in the areas that they were trained in. Establishing a state-level earned income tax credit, which would put more money in the pockets of low and moderate income families. Eliminating driver's license suspensions for non-payment of fines and fees, so that people don't get stuck in these cycles of debt that they can't get out of. And reforming the unemployment system so that people who are laid off and unemployed can actually access their benefits and have an adequate level of benefits to carry them through. And so even though these aren't all direct small business related, they are still really important for expanding economic opportunity. And that really is the big picture to take a look at. And these are some of the ways that lending your voice as a small business owner or an advocate around small businesses is really critical. These are the things that in turn create the healthy ecosystems that we need for our small businesses to really be successful.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sadaf, for that. And that what a rich set of potential initiatives and policies that we can get behind. And I want to switch to you, Dell, again. I know you have the big picture as well, and how some of the things that may be happening nationally may impact businesses and Black-owned businesses, particularly in Florida. Could I ask you to kind of build on what Sadaf has told us and give a little bit more texture around things that could be helpful to small businesses in Florida that are kind of afoot in the country?
Sure. First, I want to, point out we in Atlanta Fed recently released a guide, Small Business Owners of Color Recovery Guide, that talks a lot more about these. This is a short window to have a big conversation. So I encourage Inez and BBIF to get that out to their people, and we'll do massive outreach on this next year. That talks a lot about the things we're talking about today. But in the brief minute I have left, I just want to point out that we have to focus on the ecosystem as a whole and not just the component parts of it. And within that, you have place-based policies to focus on, like how do you develop better business districts and support those, infrastructure improvement in LMI and Black-owned communities, people policies. Not all of this is state-level policy. It's corporate policy, too, with diverse procurement, and how do we ratchet that up for Black-owned businesses and dedicated training programs. And, of course, capital access and expansion, which includes startup and restart loans. There's different ways that state governments can do these that are low cost, to create flexibility in the capitalization. And finally, general policies. Black Business Investment Fund is an example of an innovative policy to support Black businesses. We can do more of that. Sadaf talked about reducing licensing barriers and also create better transparency on the systems that already exist by better marketing. Not all of this doesn't cost a lot of money. You just have to be strategic about it.
Well, thank you, Dell, and Sadaf for that wonderful overview of different policy initiatives. It sounds like there's a lot on the go, and that is positive and encouraging. I do want to switch us, though, because we're all gathered here. I think all of us, sometimes we can feel helpless in the face of so many challenges. I do want to transition us to kind of what we can do, kind of what's the call to action here for all of us in this virtual room. So, Sadaf, can I turn to you and ask a few call to action, some things that we can actually do as individuals, as a group?
Sure. So first of all, just remember that the challenges that we're seeing today are the legacy of policies that have been in place for a very, very long time, that have been meant to exclude Black people from accessing or achieving economic security. So always have a long view. Problems that have started because of in their historical roots will take a long time and persistence in order to overcome. And so even in this political climate where it feels like the change that's possible is so small and so incremental, it's really important to keep at it, be persistent, have a long view, and make your voice heard. Small business is often thrown around in these discussions when policymakers are talking about different proposals or different ideas. But it's important to ask, does this reflect what you need as a business owner or what your community needs? And always to make sure that your voice is at the table as these policies are being shaped and implemented. There are resources available to help you do that. You can look to FPI. We have a toolkit for advocacy that goes through how do you do advocacy? How do you make meetings with your legislators? How do you what do you talk about in those meetings? How do you what do you say? How do you follow up? BBIF, you can look to the resources that they offer in terms of their expertise around small business needs and partners that they can link you to. So there are a lot of resources that you can lean on to start making your voice heard and advocate and keep asking questions and keep at it until we can see.
Well, those are great ideas, Sadaf. Thank you so much, you and Dell. And I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. I've learned a lot. It's just been great to be on this panel with you, and I want to thank you for your participation and to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
So I want to transition us now to the Zoom, the live Zoom Q&A session, which you can join all three of us in that session if you just press the join button below. And all three of us will be there I know many of you may have a lot of questions. We'll be there to address any questions you might have and carry this conversation forward. It's been great to be here with you, and I thank you for your participation in this event and listening on this panel. Many thanks.